The bell above the door didn't chime anymore. It shuddered. That was the first sign that the air in Vesper's corner had turned heavy, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. I wiped the counter for the 10th time, my eyes tracking the condensation on the window where the neon blue of the financial district bled into the jagged red of the slums. In the center of that bleed sat Kael Sorrento. He didn't look like a mobster. He looked like an architect of ruin, calm, precise, and devastatingly permanent. Every other stool in the diner was empty. Not because it was late, but because the city had learned that when the heir of the Neo-Syndicate sits, the rest of the world stands back. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at me, his gaze a physical weight against my skin. I felt the sharp prickle of danger I'd spent 23 years perfecting the art of avoiding. I was a ghost in a blue uniform, a girl who knew how to disappear in plain sight. But as Kael's fingers tapped a rhythmic, silent command against the laminate table, I realized the terrifying truth. You can't hide from a man who has decided you are the only thing worth seeing. "Refill, Mr. Sorrento?" I asked, my voice as steady as a surgeon's blade, despite the frantic drumming in my chest. He didn't push his cup forward. Instead, he laid a thick, cream-colored envelope on the table. The paper looked like it belonged in a museum or a high court execution. "The property taxes in this district are rising, Nyra. Mara was drowning. The bank was ready to turn this corner into a parking garage for the Blue Zone elites." I paused, the glass pot of coffee hovering in mid-air. Mara didn't say anything. "Mara is a survivor. She knows when to fold a losing hand," Kael said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to hum in the very floorboards. He leaned back, his tailored black sleeve shifting to reveal the edge of a tattoo, a dragon's tail coiling around his wrist. "I bought the building this morning. Every brick, every cracked tile, every breath taken inside these 4 walls. It's all mine now." A coldness settled in my stomach. I looked around the diner I'd called a sanctuary. The grease-stained walls and the flickering fluorescent lights suddenly felt like the bars of a very expensive cage. "Congratulations," I whispered, the sarcasm paper-thin. "Does the new landlord want his eggs over easy?" Kael's eyes darkened, a flash of something that wasn't quite anger. It was appreciation. He stood up, and the space between us vanished. He was a wall of heat and expensive cologne. "I didn't buy it for the real estate, Nyra. I bought it because the red zone is screaming for blood, and the gold zone is thirsty for a coup. Tomorrow, this city becomes a slaughterhouse." He reached out, his thumb grazing the stitched name tag on my chest, just above my heart. "By syndicate decree, Vesper's Corner is now a sanctuary. No guns, no blades, no blood spilled on these floors. It is the only neutral ground in the 5 boroughs." I pulled back, my breath hitching. "You're making this place a target. If the other families can't kill each other in the streets, they'll come here to talk. They'll bring their grudges to my tables." "They will," Kael admitted, his expression turning surgical. "And you will be the only one allowed to serve them. You are the face of the Sorrento peace. Every boss, every hitman, every traitor will have to look at you to get to me." He leaned in closer, his breath warm against my ear, the intimacy of it feeling like a brand. "I've cleared the room, Nyra. I've given you a throne of chrome and vinyl. Don't look so frightened. You've been watching people's hands under tables your whole life. Now, I'm just giving you a reason to make them show them." He turned to leave, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the neon-soaked window. As the door finally groaned shut, I looked down at my apron. The blue fabric felt heavier, like armor I never asked to wear. The war hadn't started yet, but as I looked at my reflection in the dark coffee, I realized the girl who stayed invisible was already dead. The silence following Kael's departure wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled by something violent. I stood behind the counter, my fingers trembling as I gripped a rag to scrub a surface that was already spotless. Outside, the city hummed with a different frequency. The usual street corner hustlers were gone, replaced by blacked-out SUVs that prowled the perimeter of the diner like sharks circling a cage. Kael had turned my sanctuary into a stage, and I was the only actor who hadn't rehearsed her lines. Nyra came out of the back office an hour later, her leather jacket zipped tight, her eyes refusing to meet mine. She didn't look like a boss. She looked like a woman who had just sold to keep her skin. "I had to, Nyra," she rasped, lighting a cigarette despite the no smoking sign she'd put up a decade ago. The debt was a mountain. Kael, he didn't just offer money. He offered a way out. He didn't offer me a way out, Nyra. He offered me a front row seat to a massacre, I replied, my voice sounding hollow in the empty room. "You're smart. You see things before they happen," she said, her voice softening with a pity that made my skin crawl. "That's why he wants you. In this city, a man like Kael has everything except someone he can actually trust to tell him the truth. Just be careful. The black suits outside aren't just there to keep people out. They're there to keep you in." She left through the back, the heavy steel door clicking shut with a finality that made the air feel thinner. I was alone. I moved to the booth where Kael had sat, reaching for the empty cup he'd left behind. My hand brushed against the pocket of my own apron, and my heart stopped. There was a weight there, something heavy, something cold. I reached in, my fingers closing around a piece of metal. When I pulled it out, the harsh overhead fluorescent lights caught the surface of a ring. It wasn't gold, and it didn't sparkle with the desperate light of a diamond. It was made of black steel, dense and unyielding, engraved with the crest of the Sorrento dynasty, a twin-headed wolf entwined in thorns. It was a piece of the Syndicate, a fragment of the iron fist that ruled the red zones. It didn't just feel like jewelry, it felt like a shackle. I stared at it, the realization washing over me like ice water. This wasn't a gift, it was a marking. In the world of the Korean Mafia, you didn't ask for a queen, you designated one. By placing this in my pocket, in a building he now owned, Kael hadn't just claimed the walls, he had claimed the woman inside them. I thought about the quiet life I had spent years building, the shifts I took to stay beneath the radar, the way I practiced my waitress face to look bored and unremarkable. It was all a lie. The moment I had looked Kael Sorrento in the eye and didn't flinch, I had ceased to be invisible. I had become a variable he needed to control. A shadow crossed a front window. A man in a crimson suit, one of Rafe Calder's associates, stopped on the sidewalk. He didn't come in. He couldn't. Kael's law forbade it. But he leaned against the glass, his eyes fixed on the black steel in my hand. He smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth, and tapped a gold coin against the window pane. The message was clear. "We see you." I looked at the ring, then at the man outside, then back at the empty, quiet diner. My invisibility was gone. My safety was a memory. I slipped the ring back into my pocket, the weight of it dragging at my waist, and felt the first cold breath of the coming war. The black steel ring felt like a lead weight in my pocket as Kael's armored sedan tore through the invisible borders of the city. We left the flickering neon of the red zone behind, ascending into the gold zone, the vertical playground of the elite, where the lights didn't blink and the air smelled of ozone and expensive filtration. Here, the buildings were glass needles stitching the sky together, and every face we passed looked like it had been carved from marble and polished with spite. I looked down at myself. Kael had traded my midnight blue uniform for a silk gown the color of a bruised plum. It was elegant, high-necked, and made me feel like I was wearing a second skin that didn't belong to me. Kael sat beside me, his profile a sharp silhouette against the passing city lights. He hadn't spoken since he'd picked me up from the diner, but the silence between us was loud, a taut wire vibrating with the proximity of his shoulder to mine. "You're overthinking the dress," he said, his voice a low gravel that didn't require him to turn his head. "In the gold zone, they don't look at the fabric. They look for the weakness beneath it. Keep your chin up, Nyra. You aren't a waitress tonight. You're the reason I'm still standing." "I'm a target, Kael. Let's not romanticize it," I whispered, my hands balled into fists in my lap. We stepped out at the Zenith Lounge, a club perched so high the clouds felt like floor mats. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the hushed, terrifying power of the city's true architects. Kael led me through the crowd, his hand firm on the small of my back, a gesture of possession that felt like a warning to the room. This was his first lesson. He wasn't teaching me how to drink champagne. He was teaching me how to breathe underwater. But as we moved through the cluster of politicians and shadow brokers, my old instincts began to hum. In the diner, I survived by reading the geometry of a room, who sat with their back to the door, whose hands stayed in their jacket, whose eyes searched for the exit. The gold zone elites were more refined, but the energy was the same. It was the scent of a debt collector coming to break fingers. It was the frantic, high-pitched vibration of a man who had already decided to do something he couldn't take back. Kael stopped to speak with a Blue Zone senator, his posture relaxed, his guard seemingly down. He was playing the role of the untouchable heir, but I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at a waiter across the room. He was moving too fast. He wasn't checking the levels of the glasses he was refilling. His eyes weren't on the guests. They were fixed on the back of Kael's neck, and his right shoulder was dipped, the weight of a heavy object pulling at the seam of his white service jacket. It was the exact same twitch I'd seen 100 times in Vesper's corner right before a deal went south. "Kael," I murmured, leaning into him as if to share a lover's secret. "Not now, Nyra. The senator is speaking," Kael replied, his voice smooth and dismissive. I didn't argue. I didn't have time. I reached up, sliding my hand around Kael's neck, pulling him down toward me as if for a kiss. The sudden movement forced his body to pivot 45 degrees. A split second later, the suppressed thwip of a needle gun hissed through the air. The tiny, poisoned dart shattered a flute of champagne, exactly where Kael's throat had been a heartbeat ago. The room didn't scream. Not yet. The gold zone was too polite for that. But Kael's body went from silk to iron in an instant. His hand clamped onto mine, not in a grip of affection, but as an anchor. He looked at the waiter, who was already disappearing into the service hallway, and then he looked at me. For the first time, the surgical coldness in his eyes was replaced by a raw, jagged spark of realization. "How?" he breathed, his thumb pressing into my palm. "He had the debt in his eyes," I said, my heart finally beginning to roar in my ears. He looked like every man who's ever come into my diner knowing he couldn't pay the bill. He wasn't there to serve Kael. He was there to settle. Kael didn't look at the senator. He didn't look at the shattered glass. He stared at me like I was a map he'd finally learned how to read. "Lesson over," he whispered. "You aren't just my queen, Nyra. You're my eyes." The red gala was less of a party and more of a funeral for anyone who couldn't hold their breath. The venue was an old cathedral in the heart of the red zone, stripped of its pews and bathed in a light so crimson it made the white marble floors look like they were hemorrhaging. This was the debut Kael had promised, or threatened. I walked at his side, the black steel ring now resting on my finger, a cold anchor in a sea of sharks. I could feel the weight of 1,000 stares. The Syndicate didn't care about my face. They were looking for the flaw in Kael's armor. They expected a terrified Waitress, a girl who would crumble under the oppressive silence of the underworld's elite. I kept my spine straight, my eyes scanning the room with the same clinical detachment I used when the midnight rush at Vespers became a powder keg. "Don't let the jewelry fool you," Kael whispered, his hand resting possessively on my waist. "They are measuring the depth of your grave." "Let them," I replied, my voice a low, steady hum. "I've dealt with hungry men before. They're all the same once you realize they're just afraid of losing their seat at the table." That's when the sea of black suits parted. Rafe Calder approached us like a predator in a theatrical production. He wore a suit the color of a fresh wound, his golden rings catching the red light as he gestured broadly. He didn't look at Kael. He looked at me with a grin that was too wide, too sharp, and entirely too confident. "So, this is the little sparrow from the corner," Rafe said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding bosses stopped their murmuring to listen. He stepped into my personal space, the scent of expensive gin and cruelty rolling off him. "I must say, Kael, your taste has become pedestrian. Tell me, sweetheart, do you still smell like burnt coffee and cheap floor wax under all that silk?" The room went dead silent. It was a classic play, the public humiliation of the consort to provoke the king. Kael's grip on my waist tightened, his jaw setting into a line of granite. He was ready to end Rafe's life right there on the marble. I placed my hand over Kael's, stopping him. I stepped forward, closing the gap until I was inches from Rafe's crimson chest. I didn't look up at him. I looked through him, the way I used to look at the local drunks who thought a $5 tip bought them my dignity. "You know, Mr. Calder?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a razor through silk. "In my diner, we have a rule. If you can't afford the tab, you don't get to run your mouth. You're standing here talking about pedestrian tastes, but you're wearing 3 different scents to hide the fact that you're sweating through your shirt." Rafe's grin faltered, just a fraction. "I've spent 5 years watching men like you," I continued, my tone conversational, almost bored. "You're the type who orders the most expensive thing on the menu just to send it back because you think it makes you look powerful. But we all know the truth. You're just a middleman with a loud tailor, hoping no one notices you're over-leveraged and underprotected." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the stillness. "I might smell like coffee, but you smell like a man whose own crew is wondering if you're worth the liability. Now, are you going to move, or do I need to call the busboy to clear the trash?" Rafe's face went from pale to a mottled, ugly purple. For a second, his hand twitched toward his waistband, but Kael was already there, his presence a dark, suffocating shadow. The surrounding bosses didn't move, but I saw the flickers of amusement in their eyes, the subtle shifts in respect. I hadn't just spoken. I had read his ledger in front of everyone. Rafe let out a forced, jagged laugh, stepping back and smoothing his lapels. Sharp tongue, Kael. Careful she doesn't cut yours out next. He retreated into the crowd, his theatricality stripped away. Kael looked down at me, a strange dark pride burning in his eyes. You didn't just humiliate him, Kael murmured. You marked him. He was already marked, I said, turning my gaze back to the room. I just pointed out where the blood was already leaking. The victory at the gala had a bitter aftertaste, the metallic tang of a storm about to break. We were halfway back to the red zone when the sky over my neighborhood turned a sickly, bruised orange. It wasn't the neon blue of the corporations or the gold of the elite. It was the color of a dying star. Kael, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. He didn't need to look at his phone to know. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned as white as bone. The pact, he spat, the word sounding like a curse. Rafe didn't wait for morning. By the time we drifted around the corner of Vespers, the air was thick with the scent of melting plastic and ancient grease. The diner wasn't just burning, it was being erased. The front windows, the glass Kael had promised would protect me, lay shattered across the sidewalk like diamonds in the gutter. Flames licked the neutral ground sign Kael had hung above the door, charring it into an unrecognizable hunk of iron.
No! Get away from me! We have to save it! Ah!
It's too late! It's gone! We need to go right now!
I threw the car door open before the tires had stopped screeching. The heat was a physical war, a roaring beast that didn't care about syndicate laws or romantic declarations. Mara! I screamed, my voice cracking under the weight of the smoke. Mara, are you in there? I lunged for the entrance, but Kael caught me, his arms wrapping around me like iron bands. He pulled me back against his chest as a secondary explosion rocked the foundation, sending a plume of black soot into the night sky. Let me go! I fought him, kicking and clawing, but he didn't budge. She's out, Nyra. My men pulled her from the back office, he shouted over the roar of the fire. But you can't go in there. Vespers is gone. I stopped struggling, my body going limp in his arms. I watched as the blue booth where Kael had sat every night collapsed into the cellar. I watched my vintage high bun unravel, my hair falling loose as the wind from the inferno whipped around us. Everything I had been, the invisible girl, the girl who survived by being nobody, was being incinerated in front of my eyes. My spare uniforms, my tip jar, the grease-stained menus where I'd memorized the city's secrets. It was all fuel for Rafe Calder's pettiness. A few yards away, Mara sat on the curb, a grey blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, her platinum hair darkened by ash. When she looked at me, there was no anger, only a hollow, terrifying acceptance. She had warned me. The ghost doesn't get to keep her haunts once she puts on a crown. I looked down at the black steel ring on my finger. It was the only thing that hadn't melted. The fire reflected in its dark surface, making the twin-headed wolf look like it was breathing. He did this to hurt you, I said, my voice dropping to a flat, dangerous register. But he used my life to do it. Kael stepped around to face me, his hands cupping my face. His thumbs wiped the soot from my cheeks, his eyes searching mine for the girl he'd bought a diner for. But she wasn't there anymore. The girl who feared the fire had stayed inside that building. Rafe thinks he broke the sanctuary, Kael murmured, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood in my veins. He thinks he took your power. He didn't take it, I said, stepping out of his reach and looking at the ruins of my old life. The diner was a skeleton now, a blackened ribcage in the middle of the city. I looked at the black-clad soldiers Kael had stationed at the perimeter, their weapons finally drawn, their eyes waiting for a command. He just gave me a reason to stop playing defense. I turned to Kael, the heat of the fire at my back and the coldness of the future in my heart. You told me the war starts tomorrow. You were wrong. It started tonight. Now, take me to your house. I want to see the maps. The Sorrento stronghold didn't smell like rain and tobacco anymore. It smelled like copper and antiseptic. The war room was a subterranean bunker of glass and steel, filled with glowing tactical maps of Neon Cross City, but the light was currently blocked by the frantic movement of private surgeons. Kael lay draped across a leather terminal chair, his black shirt shredded and soaked through with a terrifying amount of blood. A high-velocity round had caught him during the retreat from the diner, a parting gift from a Calder sniper. His breathing was ragged, a wet sound that made the air in the room feel heavy and suffocating. "The red zone is collapsing," one of the captains barked, his voice tight with panic as he stared at the monitors. "Calder's people have taken the bridge. If Kael doesn't give the order to counterattack now, the Neo-Syndicate is a memory by dawn." "He's in shock," the surgeon whispered, hands trembling as he applied pressure to the wound. "He can't lead like this." The room was full of men, soldiers, hitmen, and lieutenants who had spent their lives following the iron will of the Sorrento name. Now they were looking at each other, the first flickers of desertion sparking in their eyes. They weren't just afraid of Rafe Calder, they were afraid of being leaderless. I stepped into the center of the room, the silk of my plum-colored gown torn at the hem, my skin still smudged with the ash of the diner. I didn't look like a queen. I looked like a survivor who had run out of things to lose. "Sit down, Captain," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the flat, lethal resonance of a gun being cocked in a quiet room. The man turned, a sneer curling his lip. "This is syndicate business, Waitress. Go find a closet to hide in." I walked toward him, not stopping until I was deep in his personal space. I didn't flinch. I reached out and grabbed his wrist, the one hovering near his sidearm, and twisted it just enough to get his attention. I held up my hand, letting the light from the tactical map hit the black steel ring. The twin-headed wolf seemed to snarl in the flickering glow. "Kael Sorrento bought my diner because I see what other people miss," I said, my voice dropping to that intimate, terrifying low Kael used when he was about to end a life. "Right now, I see a captain who is looking for an excuse to run. If you walk out that door, you aren't a defector, you're a ghost. And you know what Kael does to ghosts." I turned away from him before he could respond, addressing the entire room. I looked at the maps, the red and gold zones bleeding into each other. I saw the patterns, the way Calder's men were overextending, the same way Rafe overextended his tongue at the gala. "The bridge isn't a loss, it's a bottleneck," I commanded, pointing to the glowing blue zone border. "Rafe is theatrical. He wants a parade. He's funneled his best hitters onto that strip because he thinks he's already won. Pull the units back from the docks. Let them think we're retreating. When they reach the midpoint, blow the pylon stabilizers. Drop the bridge. Let the river take the trash out." "That's a scorched earth play," another lieutenant stammered. "Kael wouldn't—" "Kael isn't speaking right now. I am," I cut him off, stepping back toward the chair where Kael's hand hung limp. I took his cold, blood-stained fingers in mine, squeezing them. He didn't wake, but his pulse fluttered against my palm. I am the Sorrento voice until he stands up. If you want to live to see the sun, you'll do exactly what I say. Now, move, or I'll start the executions with the people in this room." The silence stretched for a heartbeat, the moment where they decided to kill me or obey me. Then, the captain I'd shamed snapped a salute. "Yes, ma'am. Stabilizers. Now!" The room erupted into motion. I stayed by Kael's side, my thumb tracing the wolf on the ring. I had spent my life trying to be invisible, but as I watched the monitors flicker with the start of a counteroffensive, I realized the truth. In Neon Cross City, the only thing better than being a ghost was being the one who decided who became one. The smoke over Neon Cross City didn't clear. It just changed color, shifting from the angry orange of active arson to a heavy, mournful grey. The silence that followed the collapse of the bridge was absolute. Rafe Calder was no longer a threat. He was a footnote, his theatricality buried under tons of twisted steel and river silt. The coup had failed not because of a soldier's strength, but because of a waitress's memory for patterns. I stood on the obsidian balcony of the Sorrento penthouse, the wind whipping my loose hair around my face. Below me, the city sparkled with a deceptive, fragile beauty. From this height, the red, blue, and gold zones looked like a circuit board, and for the first time in my life, I understood how to solder the connections. The glass door behind me slid open with a soft hiss. Kael stepped out, his movements slow and stiff, his torso wrapped in heavy bandages beneath a fresh black silk shirt. He looked paler than usual, the shadows under his eyes etched deep by the blood he'd lost. But the surgical precision was back in his gaze. He didn't look like a man who had almost died. He looked like a man who had finally been found. He stopped a few feet away, leaning against the railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed through the smog. "The other families have called for a summit," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They aren't asking for terms anymore. They're asking for permission to continue operating." "And what did you tell them?" I asked, not turning around. "I told them the peace at Vesper's Corner was a courtesy they didn't deserve. I told them the new rules are being written by the woman who broke the Calder line." He moved closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and antiseptic following him. "They're terrified of you, Nyra. They can't calculate a woman who knows their debts better than their accountants do." I looked down at my hand. I had spent the night gripping the black steel ring in my palm, the metal biting into my skin until I bled. I hadn't put it on. Not while the fire was burning, not while Kael was dying. I didn't want a ring given in a diner out of a desire for ownership. "You said I could be your queen or your ghost," I said, finally turning to face him. The sunrise caught the sharp planes of his face, making him look like a statue of a god no one prayed to anymore. But ghosts are easy to ignore, and queens are just symbols people wait to replace. I held up the ring. The twin-headed wolf glinted in the dawnlight. "I'm not wearing this because you bought my diner, Kael. And I'm not wearing it because I'm yours." I stepped toward him, the silk of my ruined gown whispering against the stone. I slid the black steel onto my finger, the fit perfect, the weight final. "I'm wearing it because this city is a business, and I'm the only one who knows how to collect." Kael's eyes sparked with something hotter than obsession. It was respect. He didn't reach for my waist. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, the two Sorrento rings clicking together with a sharp metallic sound. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a merger. "The war didn't end last night, did it?" he murmured, looking out over the sprawling vertical maze of Neon Cross. "No," I replied, leaning my head back to watch the first light hit the higher spires of the gold zone. "The war just changed management." I wasn't the girl from the diner anymore. I wasn't the invisible observer. I was the architect of the new order. As the city woke up to a world where the Sorrento name was feared more than ever, I realized that Kael hadn't given me a throne. He had given me a weapon. And I intended to use it until every debt in this city was paid in full.